Hi everyone, Magnus here. The Hikaru versus Hans Speed Chess Championship match for third place has just finished, and I've got one game from the 5-minute portion, one from the 3-minute, and one from the 1-minute portion. To show you guys, I picked these out as I thought they were some of the more interesting games and really told the story of the match. Now, I'm going to be giving you a rundown section per section, starting each of the games. This is the 5-minute portion, which was actually pretty back and forth. I believe it ended with Hikaru being +1. Hikaru was winning games, built up a pretty big advantage at first. Then Hans started striking back, and this is one of those games which Hans struck back. Started with pawn e4, we have e5, and we get one of these Roy Lopez. Hikaru going for his same setup that he was trying yesterday against Alireza, going for this pretty cagey setup with d6, f6, this kind of triangle, not like the London where you've got this triangle, but a different triangle, which makes the king a little bit weaker here. And I find this knight on g6 looks like it can be targeted by the pawn, which is exactly what Hans goes for. Starts regrouping his pieces. Bishop now spies this long diagonal here. Hikaru also regrouping, looking to try and break in the center. But Hans re-maneuvers his knight from f1 to g3, spends a little bit of time to come up with some of the news. Actually, maybe not so much in this game, but the theme of this match is that Hans was always down on time, but it looks like in this game he was being much more decisive and had clearly made a mental decision to try and switch things up and bring the heat. Because at this stage, I believe Hans was down 2 or 3 games in the 5+1 portion, and he was really looking to strike back. This would be a big confidence booster. So h4, as I mentioned, trying to go after this g6 knight, maybe wedge the pawn all the way to h6 and try and destabilize the black position. Hikaru moves his rook to the center. Hans continues his crusade with the h-pawn. Hikaru had created a retreat square, though, with his rook after moving it away for the knight. And Hans goes knight to h4. I guess maybe on h6, he didn't like the fact that g5 potentially could be played. And the sacrifice doesn't look very clear here for white, as the knight can in fact cover up on g8, and you've got the horses in the back holding everything together. There is no bishop f6 check, and potentially this doesn't look so good. For that reason, Hans played knight h4 first. I think this is a very nice patient move, saying if you go h6, then look at all of these light squares. Even bishop h6 sacrifices are on the cards. You know, if the king moves over, queen f6, you know, there's all kinds of rook lifts, knight f5, and everything falls apart. So instead of that, Hikaru decides to strike in the center. Everyone's taught strike in the center if you're getting attacked on the side, and this time is no different. But Hans continues with his plan h6, very aggressive, saying that if you want to take in the center, I'm taking on g7, and then I'm coming in with bishop h6. And it's going to be bad news. Maybe rook takes e4, and like, so let's say takes, and you know, the bishop can capture this guy, remove the defender of this bishop. You know, rooks are coming to the center, and it's all falling apart. Whoops, a little bit of a spoiler there, but g5 was played against h6 rather than the much more natural move pawn to g6. I have no idea what Hikaru was going for. I guess he was baiting Hans and saying, come at me, waving the red flag at the bull, but Hans, you know, charges headfirst into the red flag. The g5 pawn is captured. Bishop takes g5. Brilliant move here. You know, Hans goes in with the queen. Hikaru trying to cover up with this knight, because if you were to cover up with the other knight, for example, there would be a mate in 2 with queen f6, queen g7. So Hikaru not falling for that, he unleashes the queen into the defense. Maybe he thought that this was just okay for black, but it still looks terrifying. The top line here was actually just capturing, followed by queen f6, king g8, and oh yeah, I guess everything just would get traded on this square, but the inclusion of the capture is quite useful because it allows the rook to enter the game and become a really menacing piece. The 2 rooks will stack up, the knight will jump in possibly to f6, and that would have ended the game. But instead, Hans kind of allowed Hikaru back into the game with this slightly sloppy conversion, as he doesn't yet have the bishop in the game. So after this recapture, actually, it's not quite the bishop that's the problem. The bishop can still enter the game, but the bishop isn't in the game immediately. And what that means is that there's a chance for rook to d6. So let me just show you, for example, after takes, bishop takes, there would be rook to d6 going after these pieces here. And additionally, after this exchange, the king now has the h7 square that it can hide on, which it didn't have before, because if you hadn't exchanged, the king doesn't have h7, so Hans should have went for this exchange in the center first. But okay, we get this trade. Rook takes on e5. Still, position looks fantastic for white. But Hikaru, as always, one of the greatest defenders, if not the greatest, does huddle up with his pieces and is hunkering down, looking for the defense. Hans decides to keep pieces on the board. I think this tricky move, knight to h5, was being pointed out by the commentators because after queen takes f6, knight takes f6, and for starters, you can't take the knight because there is a checkmate with the rook. And if you were to take the queen, then knight takes king f7 and maybe even h7, and the pawn is sneaking through like a slippery eel. This knight is preventing the rooks from guarding the back rank. Apparently this is not the best, you should have traded first, but it doesn't really matter. Anyway, Hans doesn't go for that. He decides to keep his queen on like this, and after knight to e6, which looks like a natural move, Hikaru trying to drive the pieces back. Here, Hans sacrifices the rook. Rook takes e6. Very nice stuff. If bishop takes on e6, there would be bishop takes on g6, attacking the queen and causing all kinds of nasty discoveries. So instead we see queen takes and bishop to f5. Beautiful move here. If you were to just take on g6 sloppily, then there would be king to h8, getting out of trouble. But the inclusion of bishop to f5, forcing the queen to move, and then taking on g6, means that if the king were to move to the side, there's this crucial move, knight to f5, gaining a tempo on the queen, which is actually what was played in the game. And after queen to f8, rook e1, the final piece has entered the party. Rook d7 and knight to e7. Hans looking to try and get the g6 square for his knight potentially. If he retreats the bishop, knight g6 would be devastating. Apparently there is one move here to hold the game, which is rook to d6, which looks like a very difficult move to play. I'm guessing the idea is queen to f6 and just trying to consolidate with these pieces. But Hikaru plays the very natural move, bishop to d8, and the idea... Actually, I guess the idea is just to try and bring the bishop in, but even bishop to b1 looks very strong, going for knight g6. But, of course, Hans ends the game in style. After trading the pieces, rook takes, he finds queen f6, killing the game here, sacrificing his last piece and taking advantage of the fact that the bishop has blocked the rook out of the game and ending in this very nice checkmate with the pawn and the bishop covering everything. As you can see, this pawn here, this h-pawn, Harry the hero, running up the board and controlling this critical dark square for Hans to win. But that was not the story of the whole match. The 3+1 section was all Hikaru, and Hikaru was just dominating here. I believe Hans had a very close game. This was the game, I think, that probably sent Hans down into Tilt City and never returning. I'm just going to show it to you guys, but after this one, Hans proceeded to lose, I think, 4 or even 5 games plus in a row, maybe a couple draws here and there, but it was a very, very bad 3+1 section. So, Hikaru was going for this very weird double fianchetto setup, doesn't really have a name. He was getting good positions with it though. Knight comes to c3, and he was getting an exchange. So he sort of has like this advanced c pawn, Hans has this advanced d pawn. Hikaru wants to probably play on the queen side, and maybe Hans is looking to try and shut it down, exchange, and then play in the center. So you want to play where you're strongest, where your most advanced pawn is. For Hans, his most advanced pawn is the d pawn, which means that he kind of wants to play in this direction. But for Hikaru, his most advanced pawn is the c pawn, which means you want to get the c pawn a friend and try and push your queenside pawns up the board, do some damage, and complement this light squared bishop. Anyway, we see an exchange. Hikaru, very interesting here, doesn't take with the bishop. A lot of us would just aimlessly take with the bishop here, trying to keep the pawn, trying to stop there being a passed d pawn. But Hikaru, very nice, understands that this pawn is going to be very helpful in pushing his kingside majority now, because there's now a 4-on-3, and if Hikaru can get that moving, potentially this bishop would even get trapped. Although Hans goes for this tricky move, bishop f5, bishop e5, which looks like it runs directly into f4. And if you were to simply move the bishop back to like c7, say, all of a sudden f5, ignore the engine, and this bishop would get trapped. Of course, this knight is hanging, but after the knight were to move, that theme would be in the air. Okay. But in fact, after f4, there would be this very nice move, d3, dirty little move by Hans. And if you were to take the pawn, then you would take the bishop. And if you were to, take the bishop, I would take your queen. Okay. So after bishop to e5, Hikaru closes it all down, queen d2, no more discovery for you. And after d3 comes anyway, Hikaru just trades and plays f4. And this position is crumbling. Commentators were saying perhaps Hans overestimated his activity with something like queen d4, but I'm not even sure. Potentially, Hans was already getting a little bit tilted in this match, as I believe his previous game was also quite a nasty loss. As like in this one, the bishop would simply be getting trapped with something like g4 and f5, as I pointed out earlier. Okay, so f4, knight retreats. Hikaru simply claims a free pawn here. There is no good discovery with the knight. Hans gives a check, king h2, and it looks like this game is all Hikaru pushing back Hans, claiming the center file, contesting it, and simply looking to exchange some pieces here. He continues to march forward using his extra pawn, pushing Hans, but wait a minute. Hans is actually not looking too bad here. It turns out that Hans has blockaded on the dark squares, accompanying his light squared bishop pretty nicely, and has somehow managed to activate his rook on the second rank. And with this last move, h5, it looks like the g5 square has opened up for the knight, potentially jumping into the center of the board. So Hans gives up his bishop for the very strong white knight, gallops his horsey into the g5 square, and all of a sudden, these pawns are a little bit loose, and maybe Hans is looking to try and claim control of the center file and try and fight back against the slightly weak king. Hikaru continues to push forward, and we do see an exchange of queens, but Hans looks like he might be getting around to blockade with this move, king to e7, guarding the f6 square, and it becomes very questionable about how Hikaru can accurately defend his queenside pawns. Although, once again, Hans very low on time, as always, down a full minute on the clock, is just not going to cut it. f6, by the way, is just a crazy move from Hikaru, a pretty inexplicable pawn blunder. He just gives away this e6 pawn here. I guess he was assuming that there would be this recapture, and then after the king moves, he takes on h6, and that would be a good transformation, but he simply blundered the pawn on e6. And if you were to exchange these pawns, that would also be no good. He does play bishop e4, but after this return, turns out that Hans is actually just up a clean pawn here. Actually, he's about to be up a pawn, a bunch of pawns, after the exchange of rooks, because this rook has nowhere to go but f2. I was saying that Hans is about to be up a pawn because this queenside structure is very loose. But Hikaru does have one move here, rook f2, trying to hold the position together, and we enter this knight versus bishop endgame, which is very, very dangerous for Hikaru, especially given that the king has got a straight path in to start attacking all of these white pawns. So, both players centralize their kings, Hans putting his pawns on dark squares, trying to, get them to safety, and now the knight starts jumping around. He starts doing lots of weird dances with the knight, hopping every which way, until finally he finds this magic square for his knight. It can jump either this way or that way, attacking either of the pawns and really spreading the white defenses thin. He activates the king to the center square, and finally the nail in the coffin, or so it would seem, is that this pawn's going to fall, followed by this pawn, And then Hans can just sacrifice his knight for the h-pawn, and it's gonna be happy days with these two pawns running down the board, escorted by the king. One will sack for the bishop, the other one will promote. Okay, looks like Hans is just cleaning up, absolutely. But wait a minute, c3 comes, and all of a sudden, after king takes h6, this pawn is guarded, and if you push it, like happens in the game, boom, bishop takes, knight takes, and king g6, ultra accurate from Hikaru, and to Hans's disgust, he cannot retreat his knight back and stop the pawn. The knights are notoriously bad at stopping these h-pawns. Hans was super upset about this one. There's literally just no path back, because there is no good checking square. You can even play, I think this move looks good. The knight has no checks on the king, and you're just going to promote. Okay, but instead of that, Hans does play on. He plays a5, a4, a3, and it looks like the black pawn is very close to making it. Hikaru makes one slip here, king f5, and after king to b3, the pawn looks like it's going to make it to a2 and then a1, and there should be a draw. There's some checks that get played, but after a bunch more checks, Hans finally slips up with king c3. He had to play king b2. I don't know why he wasn't just shuffling between these two squares trying to push. But after, oops, no, lost the position there. Okay, but after king to c3 and this other check, there is the move queen a2. And basically, Hans would be in zugzwang. The knight has to stay guarding the pawn, but the king can't really guard the knight. And then the white king would just walk in. But Hikaru doesn't play that. He does still play a winning move, though. King e4, and the king is simply making its way in, escorted by the queen. Hans was not happy about this one, and after this game, really everything just started to turn Hikaru's way. I'll give you guys one bullet game just to illustrate. This was also a pretty lopsided match in the bullet. We just get this kind of Roy Lopez, pieces get exchanged. Hikaru, as always, retreating his horses, kicking Hans back, looking for this weird fianchetto setup, setting up on the dark squares. But let's just continue. Hikaru's been playing queen f8 and queen f1 a lot in this match. I don't really know what he's up to be honest. He probably knows better than me. But after queen to f, actually no, okay, queen f8 gets out of knight f5, I imagine. Actually, that makes a lot of sense. But after queen to f8, Hans goes knight f5. Oh, wait, sorry, f4 takes. Couple more moves, and then he plays knight f5 anyway. And I feel like this was just Hans sort of losing the plot a bit, or maybe he did just miss one of Hikaru's defensive moves. But Hans just kind of was going all in, trying to kill the king, and admittedly it does look pretty scary. But Hikaru, you need to have ideally two more attacking pieces than your opponent has defenders. There is a rook, two knights, and a queen here, and there's only a knight, queen, and a rook that can potentially attack. So this is probably not going to be sufficient. Rook e3 gets played. Only move, by the way, queen h7. Not that I can even really come up with another move. Maybe knight to f8 is something that you would think of, but this just looks terrible. So really, queen h7 is the only move, but also kind of an obvious move. After rook g3, then there's just king h8, and you cover up with the two rooks, and that would be an easy defense. So Hans tries to go for it with knight e7, but the king just ventures out. Knight on f6 guards the queen, so this is not a problem. They get exchanged, and the game is just over. Hikaru regroups with his little piece cluster in the center, and seeing that he is down a horse and the bishop, Hans decides to throw in the towel in this one, tries to get a couple more bullet games going, but with very little success. And Hikaru ends the match, I believe, with a score of either like it's either +8 to +10. It was a pretty big landslide by the end of it. So Hans staying close in the 5+1, but couldn't keep up with Hikaru as the time got shorter. He was always down on time the whole match, and potentially just couldn't keep with the pressure. So if you guys did enjoy this recap, please do consider liking and subscribing. I will be back tomorrow with the Magnus versus Ferrugia game. That will be very interesting to see. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.